Hey guys, tonight we drift into the half-lit corridors of a prison where poetry and power collide. The air is stale with sweat, cigarette smoke, and the kind of silence that only exists when men are calculating their next move. In one corner, cell, away from the usual noise, a young man bends over torn paper, scratching out verses that don't rhyme, but bleed. His name is Raffaele Cutolo, and he's writing his way into power. Not with a gun, not yet, with a pen. This isn't your usual bedtime tale. Because tonight, we're crawling into the cracked tiles and yellow lights of Naples 1981, where the Camorra doesn't just control streets, it whispers through sonnets. You'll hear the sound of prison gates locking and the subtle shuffle of influence being passed cell to cell. But don't be fooled by the quiet. You probably won't survive this story with your romantic ideas of the mafia intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Raffaele is 19. He's already got blood on his hands and a future carved out by a judge's gavel. He's in Reale prison, one of those Neapolitan institutions where the inmates run the schedule better than the wardens. It's 1963, and the guards barely bother asking why Cutolo needs extra paper. After all, it's not like poetry is contraband. Not yet, but this isn't Shelley or Neruda. This is something else. A language forged in Neapolitan slang, soaked in Catholic imagery, and edged with quiet violence. He calls his first real piece, O Cor Mio, My Heart. You wouldn't know it from the title, but it's a declaration, not of love, but of rule. Outside his cell, fights break out over cards, debts, and insults. Inside his mind, something more dangerous is taking shape. He's realized something. In prison, you don't need muscle, you need myth. And what better way to build myth than to make yourself the tragic hero in a poem everyone passes around like sacred scripture? He reads it aloud to no one, but he knows others are listening. Even in the silence in Reale, silence listens back. Cutolo's cellmate, a quiet Sicilian with a twitch in his right eye, offers him coffee and a warning. Write too well, he says, and you'll find yourself in charge. The Sicilian isn't wrong. There's something unnerving about how people start quoting Cutolo's lines like they're coded instructions. Not orders, but suggestions. Strong suggestions. Many people still think that if Raffaele had stayed illiterate, Naples would have slept easier for decades. So what do you think? Would he have still risen if he'd never picked up that pen? Meanwhile, his reputation slinks ahead of him like a shadow in torchlight. Other inmates nod when he walks by, not out of fear yet, but out of curiosity. Who is this kid quoting Dante and spitting rhymes about honor and betrayal? He doesn't deal drugs, doesn't shiv anyone, but his influence grows. He sends a poem to a girl on the outside, his first and last love. They say she cried, but didn't reply. Maybe she knew what he was becoming. Maybe she just preferred boys who didn't speak like prophets. Even now, in this early stage, Raffaele knows the difference between control and chaos. He chooses control. He watches the prison hierarchy and starts sketching it in his head like a map. Who plays cards where? Which guards turn the other cheek? Who trades cigarettes for protection? And all of it becomes fodder for the next poem. Sometimes he reads out loud at night. Just a few lines, Something about betrayal, or mother, or fire. The others stop talking. Even the snorers pause, like they're dreaming his words. Historically speaking, 1960s Naples is a pressure cooker. The Camorra is fragmented, its leadership arrested or aging. A power vacuum hums in the background. In the city streets, small gangs rise and fall over stolen motorbikes and bootleg cigarettes. The government is too distracted by Rome's chaos to notice the periphery turning feral. Inside Poggio Reale, though, one inmate is quietly positioning himself. He's not the strongest, not the loudest, but he's starting to sound like someone people should remember. A guard, old, grizzled, and bored, once tells him, "This place eats men alive." Raffaele smiles. "Then I'll feed it stories until it's full." The guard shrugs. Poets. He's seen worse. And on that night, in a cell that leaks when it rains and never quite gets warm, Raffaele Cutolo adds one more verse to his notebook. His handwriting is neat, sharp, almost elegant. He underlines a line in red pencil. Chi scrive, commanda. He who writes, commands. Later, that same phrase will be etched on the wall of a warehouse where a judge is found tied up and confused. But that's years away. For now, it's just ink in a book no one's supposed to read. Yet, Ottaviano is the kind of town where secrets ferment quietly. Nestled beneath the sloping shadow of Mount Vesuvius, it's not exactly famous, unless you count its uneasy proximity to catastrophe. The mountain broods over it like a silent uncle nobody dares question. And in 1941, during one of Europe's darker hours, a boy named Raffaele Cutolo is born into this tight-lipped landscape. His parents are simple. His father, a carriage driver, stoic, distant, rarely speaking more than a sentence at a time. His mother, Giuseppina, devout to the point of superstition. And then there's Rosetta, his sister. She's older, quieter, and devout in a different way. A spiritual anchor. By the time she turns 20, she's working in a convent. Prays daily. Keeps a photo of Padre Pio taped above her bed. She believes in angels. Maybe she even believes Raphael could be one. Spoiler alert, he's not. Growing up, he's not the golden child. He's hot-headed, easily offended, and faster with his fists than his words. At least for now. Ottaviano doesn't leave much room for boys like Raffaele to wander off script. You either find work in the fields, on the street, or under someone's boot. He chooses the street. It's noisier. Even as a child, he has a weird sort of charisma. Not charming in a movie star way, but magnetic. Like someone you want to keep close, just to avoid being on his bad side. At school, teachers call him clever, but inattentive. He drops out before anyone can label him anything permanent. The streets of Naples are calling, and he's ready to answer. By 16, he's already a familiar face in the local gambling dens. Half participant, half ornament. He's too young to play, but the older guys like having him around. He listens more than he talks, but when he does speak, it's got bite. "This one's got venom," an old bookmaker says, laughing as Raphael throws a bottle into the street after a loss. His sister Rosetta tries to intervene. She drags him into Sunday Mass, hoping the incense will baptize his temper. It doesn't. Still, she keeps praying. Every night, without fail. Historical records show post-war Ottaviano was a breeding ground for petty crime. Like many rural towns near Naples, it was plagued by poverty, unemployment, and a distrust of formal authority that went back centuries. Many people still think that the government's neglect of these southern areas created men like Cutolo as much as personal choices did. So what do you think? Can crime be written into geography? Raphael's early brush with trouble isn't cinematic. It's pitiful. He punches a local butcher's son over a football game. The kid ends up with a broken tooth. Cutolo spends a week in juvenile detention, which is more of a social club than a reform house. There, he meets kids with worse tempers, sharper tongues, and softer hearts. He doesn't bond with them. He learns from them. Rosetta continues to write him letters during his stints away from home. They're tender, almost pleading. She never scolds, just reminds him of who he was before the streets changed him. He folds each one and hides them under his mattress. Even now, years later, he remembers whole lines by heart. But he never writes back. One night, at 17, Raphael is drinking with friends outside a local bar. A girl, Angela, they say, walks past. Beautiful, disinterested, already promised to someone else. Raphael makes a comment. Her boyfriend steps in. It escalates. A bottle breaks. A knife is pulled. No one remembers who struck first, but by dawn, the boyfriend is dead, and Raphael is in custody. He's tried as an adult. The sentence, years in Poggio Reale. They say he didn't cry at the trial, just stared ahead, bored. Only when Rosetta stood up in the back row of the courtroom, tears on her face, crucifix clutched in both hands, did his jaw twitch. That twitch becomes legend later, retold in poems and whispered cell stories. But at the time, it's just the last expression he makes before disappearing behind bars. His mother never visits him in prison. She considers it a punishment sent by God. But Rosetta does. Every month, without fail. She brings oranges, devotional cards, and a book he never reads. One time she slips him a notebook and a pencil. "Write down your sins," she says. Even the saints had sins. He doesn't write sins, he writes warnings. His early poems are raw, misspelled, disjointed, more rants than verses. But they carry a rhythm. Something about them makes even the toughest inmates listen. "You hear that?" One of them says. "This guy's making death sound romantic." By the time he turns 20, Raffaele Cutolo isn't just a prisoner. He's an emerging myth. A man whose sister believes he can be saved, whose town whispers his name like a question, and whose pen is starting to cut sharper than any blade he ever held. The streetlight flickers just once before it dies. It's 1959 in Ottaviano, and the neighborhood is hushed in the way only a small-town Italian street can be. Buzzing softly beneath the hush, always on the edge of something. In the glow of a dim lamp, Raffaele Cutolo leans against a low wall, arms crossed, jaw tight. He's barely 18, but the anger in him is far older. Angela is here. So is her new boyfriend. They didn't expect Raphael to be waiting. She looks away. The boyfriend doesn't. What happens next is as quick as it is stupid. A sharp word, a shove, a glint of steel. Then a heartbeat later, blood on the cobblestone. The knife doesn't even make a sound hitting the ground. Just a clink, like a coin tossed into a well that swallowed 100 just like it. And there it is, the moment, the before and after of a life. Some say it was self-defense. Others claim Cutolo pulled first. Many people still think that if Angela hadn't screamed, he might have walked away. So what do you think? Was this murder, or just the loudest punctuation in a life already destined to break the rules? The local police don't take long. Ottaviano isn't New York. Everyone knows everyone. They pick him up before sunrise, his shoes still streaked with something red and hardening. At the station, Raphael barely says a word. Not from guilt, but calculation. He's learning fast. Silence, when delivered right, can rattle louder than shouting. One officer writes in his report, "He smiled once. It was unnerving. He's charged with voluntary manslaughter. The courtroom is humid and packed. Locals crane their necks. Everyone wants a look at the kid who wrote bad poetry and now stands accused of murder. His mother stays home, too ashamed to be seen. But Rosetta's there. Rosary beads clutched so tightly her palms bleed. She stares at him as though trying to rewrite him through sheer force of will. But Raphael never meets her eyes. The trial is swift. A few character witnesses try to soften his image. A teacher, a neighbor. But their voices are small against the weight of a dead body. The verdict: guilty. He's sentenced to over a decade in prison. Poggio Reale. Now, if you've never heard of Poggio Reale, think of it like this. It's less a correctional facility and more a slow-drip crucible. Built in the 19th century, the prison is a fortress of stone and mold and memories. It doesn't rehabilitate. It observes, watches how men break. The first night is the worst. The mattress is thinner than memory, and the walls breathe cold. Inmates grunt in their sleep, curse in dialects Raphael barely recognizes. He hears rats, not metaphors, actual rats, scurrying above the pipes, but something shifts in him that night. He doesn't cry, doesn't pray. He watches the ceiling until his eyes ache and he decides, if I'm going to rot, I'll rot famous. By the second week, he's already found a routine. Not the prison's routine, his. Mornings are for observation. Midday is for pacing. Evenings for writing. His cellmate is a bulky Calabrian named Bruno with 2 missing fingers and a laugh that comes too easily. Bruno takes a liking to Cutolo, calls him the prince. "You're gonna be someone," Bruno says, chewing on a piece of licorice one of the guards snuck in. "You got that look, like you already read the ending," and maybe he has. One day in the yard, a group of inmates plays cards. A fight breaks out. It's over cigarettes. Cutolo doesn't get involved, but later that evening, one of the losers comes to him. "They don't listen to me," he says, "but they listen when you talk. You ever think about taking sides? It's an invitation, not to a gang, but to something more bureaucratic." Raphael starts mediating, quietly. At first, it's just small squabbles, then debts, then access to the black market inside the prison. A hierarchy begins to form around him, not built on violence, but on words. He's the rare inmate who can string sentences together like incantations, not just threats, but ideas. He starts using metaphors like weapons. A man without honor is already in a different kind of prison, he tells one group. It becomes a slogan. Soon, he's got scribes, actual inmates offering to copy his poems, distribute them in exchange for favors. "Make sure they spell it right," he tells them, half joking. One of the guards, older and curious, starts reading the poems, brings them home. His daughter, 16 and impressionable, pins one to her wall. "It's like a love letter," she says. He doesn't have the heart to tell her who wrote it. That's how influence works in Poggio Reale. It seeps. Cutolo's writing improves. He reads more, whatever he can get his hands on. Dante, Machiavelli, bits of the Bible. He underlines passages, circles names. Not for understanding, but for style. He studies how words bend people. Even his handwriting shifts from jagged and rushed to elegant, sloped, almost priestly. There's a moment, quiet and oddly tender, when he and his cellmate Bruno sit back to back on the floor. reading by flashlight. Bruno's reading Il giorno della civetta, a mafia novel that's more truth than fiction. You ever think we're the bad guys? He asks. Raffaele doesn't look up. We're the ones writing the story. That's enough. And in that moment, the transformation begins in full. Cutolo, the hot-headed street kid, is vanishing. In his place, the beginnings of a monarch. A man who learns that knives win fights, but stories win wars. The prison courtyard is a dusty rectangle of routine. Laundry lines flapping, boots scuffing stone, guards pacing out of boredom rather than duty. But from the upper levels of Poggio Reale, where certain inmates earn special privileges not by law, but by leverage, a new gravity begins to form. Raffaele Cutolo doesn't pace anymore. Others do it for him. He's still young, maybe 21, but something in the way he moves, slow, deliberate, with a half-smile that doesn't invite conversation, signals a shift. He's no longer just surviving in prison. He's building something. You don't have to be fluent in Neapolitan dialect to sense it. Power is coiling around him like smoke. At first, it starts with organization. He notices the disorder, how guards barter for silence, how inmates scramble for basic things like soap or coffee. He steps in quietly at first. He mediates, he brokers. A stolen radio? He knows who has it. Cigarette debt gone wrong? He'll resolve it, minus the stabbing. And then he does something no one expects. He keeps his promises. In a system built on petty betrayal, Raffaele's consistency feels revolutionary. Word spreads. If Cutolo says he'll protect you, he will. If he says your name's safe, it stays that way. Unless, of course, you cross him. But so far, nobody does. Soon, he has a structure. Not a gang. Not yet. It's more like a court. With rules, with roles. His lieutenants wear no badges, but the respect is tangible. Men nod when they pass. Some even step aside. Historically, Poggio Reale in the 1960s was known for being overcrowded and corrupt, a powder keg of unmonitored influence. Many people still think that it was here, not on the outside, that Cutolo built the foundations of what would become the Nuova Camorra Organizzata. So what do you think? Was prison the punishment or the perfect training ground? Raffaele begins codifying behavior. He starts drafting unwritten rules, then writes them. A list of expectations for anyone wanting his protection or favor. It's part Camorra ethics, part personal philosophy, part poetic nonsense. But it works. No stealing from fellow inmates. No assaults without mediation. Honor, he says, is a currency you don't print twice. He calls it the Nuova Camorra. Not just a name, a statement. The new Camorra will be cleaner, sharper, more centralized. Less about brute force, more about strategy. Less street scum, more statesman. It sounds absurd, maybe even comical. But inmates start lining up, asking to be part of something. Anything. Even a prison-born ideology. He doesn't recruit everyone. He's selective. He watches how people react to stress, who folds under pressure, who talks too much during yard time. Trust for Cutolo is earned on bad days. Outside, Naples stirs. The old Camorra is a mess. Fractured clans bickering over turf and pride. The Sicilian mafia is starting to push north. Politicians are distracted. The people? They're exhausted. No one's offering structure. Until now. In Poggio Reale, Raffaele takes meetings. He sits on a stool in his cell, like it's a throne. Inmates come in one by one. They make their case. They offer loyalty. Sometimes they recite his own poetry back to him, not because they believe in it, yet, but because they know it opens doors. He doesn't smile when they do it. He listens, weighs them. You understand the words, or just the rhythm? He asks one man, a young smuggler from Salerno. The rhythm, the man admits. Raffaele nods. Good. The rhythm is harder to fake. There's something unnerving about how calmly he speaks now, as if each sentence has been edited 10 times before it hits his lips. The prison chaplain, an old man with soft eyes and softer theology, tries to counsel him one afternoon. You've got a gift, he says. But gifts can be traps, too. Cutolo thanks him, then offers the priest a cigarette and a prayer written in verse. The chaplain accepts both. Not everyone inside likes what's happening. A few of the older inmates, men from the old Camorra, begin to stir. They mutter about arrogance, about rules made by boys who've never lost a war. One tries to confront Raffaele in the showers. 3 days later, he's transferred to a different wing. No one knows who requested it, or why the man looks like he hasn't slept in days. Raffaele continues writing. His notebook now has tabs, colored markers, a table of contents, titles like On Betrayal, The Nature of Obedience, Why I Write in Blood. He's not writing for fun. He's building a doctrine, and in a surreal twist of bureaucracy, the guards allow it. Some even support it. He keeps the peace, they say. Better him than chaos. There's a joke whispered among the staff. If Cutolo ran the whole prison, maybe we'd actually get lunch on time. The warden doesn't laugh, but he doesn't stop it either. In a small moment, almost forgettable, Raffaele visits the infirmary. A young inmate is dying, not from violence, but from tuberculosis. The man asks for a poem, something to remember the world by. Raffaele obliges. He writes it slowly, speaks it softly. It's about Vesuvius, about mothers and mornings and the smell of oranges in the rain. The man dies that night, holding the poem like a relic. Someone pins it to the wall above his bed. It stays there for months, untouched. Even in death, Raffaele's words seem to linger longer than most men's lives. It starts as a whisper through the rusted pipes, travels cell to cell like smoke under doors. Cutolo's writing again. Not just a poem this time. It's something longer, sharper, almost coded. The kind of language that makes men stop shaving mid-stroke just to hear it read aloud. His words aren't about flowers or broken hearts. They're about fire and loyalty, about betrayal and metaphors too elegant to ignore. One line in particular gets repeated like a chant. He who forgets the weight of silence will drown in applause. Nobody's exactly sure what it means, but everyone acts like they do. That's the point. Cutolo begins distributing his verses strategically. He gives them to men with mouths, but no plans, men who owe him protection, and now find themselves carrying verses like gospel. One guard, usually indifferent, asks for a copy. Raffaele gives it to him with a nod, saying only, "Be careful who you read it near." The guard chuckles until he notices 2 inmates stop talking every time he passes. The poetry isn't innocent. It carries undercurrents, references to real debts, past betrayals, unspoken alliances. Anyone who understands the context knows exactly who he's talking about. And those who don't, they pretend to, because nothing is more dangerous than appearing uninformed around Cutolo's name. Many people still think that Raffaele's poetry doubled as a codebook, orders layered in simile. So, what do you think? Was it literature or logistics in disguise? Out in the yard, a fight breaks out. One inmate accusing another of twisting Cutolo's words in the wrong way. "You said the hand that feeds must never flinch. You meant me." The accused denies it, says it was a general metaphor. Raffaele doesn't comment, but the next day, the accuser ends up in the infirmary. Broken ribs, no witnesses, a message delivered without a word. Cutolo's verses begin appearing on walls, scratched in with nails, ink, or just dirt. On a cell block door, someone etches, "Obedience wears no chains, only a crown too heavy for liars." It's haunting, almost devotional. A prisoner from the old Camorra stops in front of it, scoffs, then mutters, "He's turning crime into a church." Raffaele isn't offended. He smiles. That's the point. Soon, younger inmates approach him with verses of their own. Some are terrible, others promising. He corrects them, gently. "You've got the rhythm," he tells one, "but not the fear." They don't know what he means, but they nod anyway. Word spreads beyond Poggio Reale. Through lawyers, letters, cousins, the message leaks into Naples. In the alleyways of Secondigliano and the bars of Sanità, kids start quoting lines they barely understand. They write them on desks, in notebooks, in the margins of grocery lists. His voice is growing legs outside of steel bars. Meanwhile, inside, Raffaele becomes calm, a strange calm, like a conductor before the symphony begins. He speaks less, listens more. His lieutenants handle most of the grunt work now: trade disputes, smuggling, reputation management. He only steps in when something truly interesting crosses his desk, or when a poem requires it. He starts composing during storms, claims the thunder helps him feel honest. Historically, this period, late 1960s to early 70s, saw the early bones of the Nuova Camorra being laid inside prisons across southern Italy. But Poggio Reale was the furnace, and Cutolo was the blacksmith. It wasn't just about crime. It was about identity. He gives himself a nickname, O Professore, the Professor, not out of arrogance, out of design. It sticks. He writes a piece called The Kingdom Beneath the Uniform, and it causes a minor earthquake in the prison ranks. Guards begin treating him differently. Some salute half-jokingly. Others avoid him entirely. They don't want to be quoted in the next poem. One young priest tries to befriend him, comes bearing books and conversation. Raffaele listens, nods, then reads the priest one of his darker verses about faith and blood and the smell of ash after betrayal. The priest never returns. "Too heavy," one inmate mutters. "Even for God." Rosetta visits, as always. She brings pastries and holy cards. He thanks her, kisses her hand like a knight would. She doesn't read his poems, says she prefers her prayers quieter, but she takes the notebook anyway, says she'll keep it safe. There's a moment during one of these visits where she asks, "Do you think you'll get out one day?" Raffaele leans back, watching the pigeons behind the visitation glass. "Maybe," he says, "but part of me hopes not. Out there, they don't listen." The poetry continues. He writes about death in metaphors so tender they almost pass for lullabies. One verse compares a knife wound to a confession never finished. Another likens betrayal to a blanket too short for winter. They're strange. They're beautiful. They're dangerous. Soon, even rival Camorra bosses, outside, begin quoting him, sometimes in respect, sometimes in sarcasm, but always carefully. The line between art and threat is gone. Even scholars start to notice. A local university professor, bored and mildly reckless, includes a Cutolo poem in a seminar about subversive literature. It sparks debate. Should criminals be treated as artists? Is poetry still poetry if it points a gun? That same night, a law student copies the poem onto a wall near Piazza Dante. The next morning, Someone scrawls beneath it, "Long live the Professor," and just like that, Raffaele Cutolo's voice echoes where his body cannot go. Outside the prison gates, Naples is unraveling, not in fire or blood, at least not yet, but in something subtler, a sense that no one is really in charge. The old Camorra is splintered, like a shattered mirror too jagged to reassemble. Its leaders are aging, exiled or lost in bureaucratic exile. And in this vacuum of power, whispers begin curling through the alleys. A name, Cutolo. A phrase, Nuova Camorra Organizzata. A question, who is really pulling the strings now? Inside Poggio Reale, Raffaele doesn't answer questions. He issues structure. He drafts a charter, yes. An actual document, handwritten, poetic in tone, but ruthlessly administrative in essence. It outlines the principles of the Nuova Camorra Organizzata, or NCO. Loyalty, discipline, silence, dignity, everything the old Camorra claimed but no longer practiced, and most importantly, centralization. No more endless blood feuds between micro-clans over cigarette roots or turf lines drawn in sidewalk chalk. The NCO would be one family with branches, one mind, many hands. And the mind? It would sit in a cell, scratching out strategy on paper with a pencil no one dared confiscate. He gives the document to a trusted inmate, who passes it to another and another. Within weeks, it reaches the streets. Young gangsters read it like scripture. Some kiss it before hiding it in their mattresses. Others make copies and carry it like ID. Cutolo's poetry, once a quiet rebellion, is now the propaganda arm of something sprawling. The NCO doesn't just exist. It recruits, and recruits well. From within prisons and poor neighborhoods alike, men join because it feels newer, cleaner. Not in morality, let's not kid ourselves, but in purpose. The NCO doesn't pretend to be noble. It pretends to be organized. And in Naples, that illusion is gold. Historically, the late 1970s were marked by a growing frustration with the ungovernability of southern Italy. Petty corruption, political fatigue, and economic despair created fertile ground for any figure offering order. Many people still think that Cutolo wasn't a gangster trying to mimic politicians, but a politician cleverly disguised as a gangster. So what do you think? Was he building a crime family? Or a state within a state? Back inside Poggio Reale, Raffaele starts issuing instructions through poetry, not requests, orders. He uses rhymes as ciphers. A verse about rain falling twice upon a shuttered window means a bribe should be delivered to the magistrate's cousin. A line about 4 winds, each bearing a gift, references arms shipments, smuggled through 4 regional channels. If someone questions the interpretation, they simply don't understand the poem well enough. And that's on them. In one particularly bold moment, he has a play performed in the prison chapel. A full production. Inmates act. Guards watch. The theme? A king misunderstood. A loyal knight betrayed. An empire built with nothing but words. It's fiction. Obviously, the play ends with applause, and a single copy of the script quietly disappears into the hands of a visiting priest. A month later, a rival gang leader dies of natural causes. Poetic coincidence, surely. Cutolo's reputation outside grows feral. He's become something of a paradox, a man who cannot leave his cell, yet somehow makes prison feel optional. His reach now includes drug routes, construction rackets, protection businesses, even low-level political influence. All coordinated from a man who hasn't touched a telephone in years. And the remarkable thing? He rarely touches money. Cutolo isn't interested in yachts or furs. He wants loyalty, influence, echo. His currency is myth. The money flows, of course, but through others. He spends his time refining his doctrine, tightening his circle, writing poetry that doubles as policy. One of his favorite sayings spreads like wildfire. You don't own men, you borrow their fear. That's how the NCO keeps its grip. Through dread, sure, but more than that, through belief. And belief is a dangerous tool. He creates cells within the organization, mirroring military structure. Street captains report to regional lieutenants, who report to high-ranking liaisons, who report to a man staring out of a barred window, reading Virgil by candlelight. An inmate once asks, "Do you ever get tired of pretending you're not in charge?" Cutolo shrugs. "No, I get tired of pretending it matters. Not everyone's thrilled. Old Camorra clans are agitated. They don't like the NCO. They don't like the poetry. They especially don't like being told what to do by someone who doesn't even walk free. To them, Cutolo is a poser, an upstart, a desk gangster with a pen for a sword, but they underestimate how well fear scales. One by one, their allies flip, their younger soldiers defect. The NCO isn't a gang anymore. It's a movement, and with movement comes ritual. Each new recruit swears an oath, not with blood, but with verse. They recite a Cutolo poem during initiation, eyes closed, hand on heart. It sounds absurd until you see the way they say it, trembling like altar boys before a thunderstorm. In a prison in Avellino, a guard finds a handwritten copy of a poem in a hollowed-out bar of soap. He reads it aloud and pauses. It ends with, "Those who forget their own shadow will be swallowed by mine." The guard doesn't report it. He just slides it back and walks away, because even he knows, by now, that Cutolo's shadow stretches further than most men's reach. The courtroom is packed, not just with lawyers and guards, but with spectators who claim they're here for justice, but are really here for theater. They shift in their wooden benches, craning necks toward the defendant's box, like they're waiting for the curtain to rise. And when Raffaele Cutolo enters, he doesn't disappoint. He's dressed in a tailored blue suit, modest but impeccable, as if he'd been born in it. His hair is slicked, not a strand out of place. His hands are loose at his sides, relaxed, almost amused. You'd think he was about to recite a lecture on Renaissance art, not stand trial for murder, racketeering, and ordering a half-dozen assassinations. He doesn't sit. He arrives. There's a difference. The prosecutors begin their spiel. They talk about the Nuova Camorra Organizzata as a plague on Naples, a virus in the bloodstream of southern Italy. They refer to Raffaele as the alleged architect of this criminal kingdom, but everyone in the room knows better. Alleged is just courtroom politeness. Then Cutolo is asked to speak. He stands slowly, not rushed, like time bends slightly to accommodate him. He doesn't raise his voice, but the room quiets anyway. And then he talks, not to defend himself, but to perform. "Do you know what the word honor costs today?" He begins. "About as much as a fake promise and a short memory. But I still believe in it." The court is stunned. Even the stenographer's fingers pause for a breath. He quotes poetry, his own. Not word for word, but close. He slips metaphors into legal argument like a magician hides aces. A witness falters on the stand when Raffaele simply looks at him, the way you might look at an echo that overstayed its welcome. And in the gallery, a journalist scribbles in his notepad. He speaks like a bishop, thinks like a chess player, and smiles like someone who already read the ending. Many people still think that Cutolo's courtroom presence was more effective than any lawyer's defense. So, what do you think? Was he manipulating the system, or simply revealing how little of it was real to begin with? When the judge addresses him directly, asking if he has anything else to say before sentencing, Raffaele nods. "Yes, Your Honor," he says, "but it won't make sense until you read my next poem." The judge blinks, scribbles a note, and years later, during a separate trial, that same judge recuses himself. Officially due to health reasons. Unofficially? Well, he still had that poem pinned to the inside of his office door. Outside the courthouse, photographers swarm. The news outlets print grainy black and white shots of Raphael waving like a local mayor. One photo shows him blowing a kiss, not to the crowd, but to his sister Rosetta, standing far behind the police tape, rosary in hand. She still visits, still believes, but something in her eyes now reads as worry, not for his safety, but his soul. Back inside Poggio Reale, the inmates react to the trial like it was a championship match. Some cheer, some mimic his words. One draws his face on the wall beside a quote. "Truth is just loyalty with a different name." The warden pretends not to see it. Soon after, Raphael begins receiving letters from outside admirers. Not the usual fan mail. These are from academics, writers, even priests, some praising the elegance of his speeches, others condemning the manipulation, but all agreeing on one thing. The man knows how to use silence. He keeps most of the letters, tapes a few on the wall, not as trophies, but reminders that words, when sharpened well, cut deeper than knives. There's a brief moment when he's transferred to another facility for a separate hearing, a temporary move. The guards treat it like escorting royalty, not because they respect him, but because they fear misstepping. You don't accidentally offend someone who wrote a poem about a man losing his teeth because he forgot to greet the king. At the new prison, Cutolo is placed in isolation. Just a cot, a window, and a notebook. He writes constantly, sometimes through the night. He refuses television, claims it interrupts the sentence flow. He prefers candlelight, though the guards only allow him a desk lamp. He adjusts. One guard, young, skeptical, asks him, "What do you get out of all this poetry?" Cutolo leans forward, not menacingly, just close enough. "I get to speak without raising my voice. Can you say the same?" The guard never asks again. Meanwhile, the NCO grows louder on the outside. With each arrest, a replacement appears. With each disruption, the structure bends, but never breaks. Every lieutenant knows the rules. Every new affiliate recites the verse, and every verse traces back to the man scribbling behind bars. There's one particular hearing where Raphael decides not to speak at all. Not one word. He simply stares ahead, expression unreadable. His silence unnerves the judge more than any outburst could have. When the sentence is handed down, more years, more isolation, he nods once, thanks the court, and walks out humming a tune no one recognizes. That night, a new poem is born, titled "Walls That Whisper My Name." It ends with a line that will be carved into prison graffiti across southern Italy for years. You can lock the man, but not the echo. The boy is barely 16, standing on a street corner in Secondigliano with a cigarette he's too nervous to light. His name doesn't matter. Just another poor kid in cheap sneakers, trying to look older than he is. But in his pocket, folded like a secret love note, is a handwritten verse from Cutolo himself. Not to him, of course, but to the world. It reads, "When the knife grows bored, it becomes a tongue." He doesn't understand it, not fully, but he repeats it like a spell, like saying it might make him bulletproof. He's not alone. By the early 1980s, Raffaele Cutolo's words have become currency among the youth of Naples. Boys with no fathers and too much hunger carry his phrases in their pockets. Girls write his initials in school books. Some whisper his poems before fights, like a twisted version of grace. And that's exactly how Cutolo planned it. Back in Poggioreale, his message flows like ink through a cracked wall. New inmates arrive, quoting him. "Are you NCO?" a guard asks one. "I'm loyal to the pen," the inmate replies, a phrase from Cutolo's third manifesto. Recruitment isn't loud, it's poetic. His men don't wear colors. They wear language. Initiates are expected to memorize at least 3 verses. One about loyalty, one about silence, one about what happens when you betray either. A favorite among newcomers goes, "A traitor's grave is not dug in earth, but in every name he loses." It's chilling, and yet strangely elegant. Older Camorristi scoff at this cult of words. They call Cutolo a writer playing God, but their soldiers keep defecting. The NCO offers something the older clans can't: narrative, purpose, even myth. Many people still think that the success of the NCO wasn't just about structure. It was about storytelling. So what do you think? Did Cutolo build an army, or just give one a better theme song? The NCO's growth among young recruits alarms the Italian government. They issue statements. They pass new laws. They give interviews. But their voices echo like coins dropped down a well, because Cutolo doesn't speak in policy. He speaks in poetry. And in Naples, poetry wins. One teenage member writes a letter to his mother from juvenile detention. "Don't worry," it says. "I'm with people who understand me. They taught me how to read Il Professore." His mother keeps the letter folded in her purse, next to a prayer card of the Virgin Mary. Raphael hears about these things, smiles softly. He never meets most of these kids, but he knows them. They're him, half feral, half forgotten, searching for a voice. He simply offered his. He refines the recruitment process, orders from his cell that each new initiate must undergo a test, not a physical one, but emotional. They must write their own poem about fear, about loss, about what they would die to protect. Most are crude, but some surprise even him. He reads them like confessions. Some he edits, a few he memorizes. Meanwhile, the media begins calling him Il Vate Criminale, the criminal poet. Newspapers run headlines like "The Pen That Bleeds Naples." TV pundits shake their heads in disbelief. How can a man behind bars inspire such fervor? They miss the point. Raphael isn't inspiring. It's that he's the only one speaking directly to the forgotten. There's a moment, quiet but profound, when a school teacher in Naples finds a student scribbling Cutolo's verses in the margins of his textbook. She confiscates it, scolds him, but later that night, she reads the full poem. She doesn't sleep well, not because it's violent, but because it's good. In one particular neighborhood, Ponticelli, a mural appears. It's simple. A silhouette of a man holding a pen like a dagger. Below it, the line, "We write to survive. We recite to remember." No one claims credit. No one dares paint over it. Raphael begins hosting unofficial lessons inside the prison. He never calls them that, of course. He just invites a few inmates to read with him. Dante, Ovid, sometimes even Neruda. Then they write, then they talk. One guard refers to the sessions as the School of Shadows. It catches on. Across other prisons, NCO-affiliated inmates form their own reading groups. Some read aloud to each other during lockdowns. One even puts on a performance of Cutolo's early poetry for a visiting prison chaplain. The chaplain leaves midway, says he felt unnerved. Raffaele considers that a standing ovation. But this isn't just an artistic movement. It's deeply tactical. He knows that young recruits are easier to mold. Their loyalties haven't yet calcified. Their hunger is still raw. He feeds them not with food, but with identity. One letter from a recruit in Benevento arrives with a photo attached. A group of boys in tracksuits, holding notebooks, not weapons. The caption reads, "We speak softly, but we don't speak alone." It's haunting in its calmness. Even his enemies notice. An older Camorra boss meets with a Sicilian contact. "The NCO?" he says. "They're a school, not a gang. Their graduation ceremony is a funeral. And yet, the NCO doesn't push its members into early graves the way old mafia outfits did. There's structure. There are protocols. There are ethics. In a strange, reverse-lit way. Of course, violence still simmers beneath the surface, but it's deployed with strategy. A betrayal might not earn you a bullet, but a public recitation of a poem that implies your failure, which in Naples is worse, because everyone listens, especially when the words sting. And so, from a single cell, Raffaele Cutolo continues to draft not just poems, but soldiers, one verse at a time. By now, the Nuova Camorra Organizzata isn't just a rumor whispered in dark alleys. It's a network, a system, a philosophy with uniforms stitched not in fabric, but in fear and syntax. And what does every growing system need? Bureaucracy. Cutolo, pacing the same few meters of his cell, decides it's time to turn his creation into something more durable. Less romantic, more mechanical. Poetry can only stretch so far before it frays under the weight of logistics. And so, alongside his verses, he begins crafting structure. He starts with ledgers, notebooks with coded entries, money owed, names mentioned only in metaphor, territories referred to as mythological lands, Troy, Jericho, the North Wind. Only the initiated understand who's who, and even they sometimes need a second read. Just to be sure, he assigns roles. There's the contabile, the accountant, the referent, a trusted liaison to external operations. Each prison block gets a responsabile. Each neighborhood, a voice who reports up the chain. Everything is documented, but never clearly. One page of a ledger simply reads, "The bees gather where the lemon tree leans, 13 petals this week." Only Cutolo and one other man know it means 13 successful collections in the Vomero district. Even the Sicilian mafia, long known for its rigidity, begins watching with a mix of disdain and curiosity. They'd mocked him at first, this professor with his pen. But now they recognize something old beneath the new skin. Order. Historically, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra operated on a strict vertical hierarchy. The Camorra, by contrast, had always been chaotic, clan-based, personal. What Cutolo was doing, well, many people still think he came closer to turning the Camorra into a corporation than anyone before or after. So what do you think? Can a criminal empire run like a company if its founder prefers verses to weapons? Cutolo continues issuing internal communique, handwritten, sealed, delivered through a labyrinth of smuggled routes, sometimes via bribed guards, other times via the old way, folded paper in dirty laundry. If Shakespeare were alive and criminally inclined, he might be jealous. One of the documents is simply titled L'Ordine Invisibile, the Invisible Order. It outlines decision protocols for local disputes. Not just who reports to whom, but how much blood is acceptable in a reprisal. He even includes a poem at the top. Not every silence is surrender. Sometimes it's just policy waiting its turn. Inside the prisons, this becomes scripture. Disputes are now settled using Cutolo's logic. His philosophies turned into legal precedent among men who haven't seen a real judge in years. In the outside world, the NCO mirrors the structure. Street captains hold regular meetings. Funds are collected weekly, not haphazardly. There are percentages, minimum thresholds, protocols for resolving supply chain issues. Yes, supply chain, because this is no longer a scattered gang. It's logistics. One associate jokes, "It's like working for a bank, but instead of a pension, you get a marble headstone." Nobody laughs too loudly. Even inside Poggio Reale, other inmates, unaffiliated, skeptical, begin following Cutolo's methods just to survive. They speak in metaphor. They refer to guards as spectators and punishments as weather. It's not just a code, it's a culture now. Rosetta notices the change in his letters. They're more formal, less emotional. He's still her brother, but the warmth is coded in layers of phrasing she doesn't recognize. She wonders if the poetry has become armor, or worse, a disguise he can't take off. He writes her once, "I sleep beneath rules I invented, strange bedfellows but reliable." One afternoon, a prison official visits his cell, wants to understand what's happening, why the other inmates defer to him, why guards suddenly seem more polite in his presence. The official asks directly, "Are you issuing orders?" Cutolo smiles. "I only offer advice. Some people listen." The next day, the official is reassigned. He drafts a new document, Il Vento Nero, the Black Wind. It's a list of regions under NCO protection coded by flowers. Palermo is a marigold, Caserta, a thistle, Benevento, a blue hyacinth. Why flowers? Because, as he says to a cellmate, even poison needs to bloom. He also begins collecting poetry from his affiliates, not for vanity, for diagnostics. He claims he can tell a man's loyalty, courage, and weakness from the way he describes death. He's not wrong. One poorly written verse once triggered a demotion in NCO ranks. There are some who claim Cutolo even created an internal court, a tribunal of sorts, within the prison walls. Disputes would be presented through writing, arguments made in prose, judgments handed down through epigraphs. It sounds insane, until you realize how many inmates began studying literature during their sentences. Not to pass time, but to survive scrutiny. A guard once joked, "I've never seen so many murderers worried about grammar." But even outside the prisons, the structure sticks. Cutolo's organization doesn't rely on his presence anymore. It breathes. It self-replicates. Younger affiliates are trained in the old verses. Meetings open with a recitation. Some even light candles during oath-taking ceremonies. Not because of religion, but rhythm. Everything has its pace, even punishment. When someone breaks a rule, they're not immediately harmed. They receive a letter, not a threat, a warning. One man in Salerno opens his door to find a single sheet of paper folded in quarters. Inside, just one line. Even the sharpest ink cannot write over regret. He flees to France the next morning. That's the kind of efficiency Cutolo's system cultivates. One line replaces a bullet. One page replaces a body. And through it all, Raffaele Cutolo, o Professore, remains behind a locked door, carving bureaucracy from metaphors, forging fear into form, one pen stroke at a time. The poem is titled La Rosa Sotto il Ghiaccio, the rose beneath the ice. It's barely 10 lines long, but those 10 lines are enough to stall an execution. It reaches the intended target just hours before the hit is supposed to go down. The man, a mid-level NCO affiliate accused of skimming profits, reads the verse alone in his kitchen. No threats, no names, no orders, just imagery. A frozen rose, a breathless gardener, a shadow waiting for spring. He knows exactly what it means. And more importantly, he knows Cutolo knows he knows. The execution is called off, at least for now, because that's what Raphael's poetry has become. Not just an art form, not even a doctrine, but protection. In some cases, absolution. A shield scribbled in pencil. Back in Poggioreale, Raffaele is more myth than man. He barely speaks aloud anymore unless necessary. His lieutenants, inside and out, manage most operations. His verses are delivered like sermons. Each poem, each phrase, is dissected, whispered, debated. One inmate says it feels like being part of a religion. Another says, religion doesn't come with this many deadlines. The poetry is deliberate. Every syllable pulled through a sieve. He spends hours on one stanza, days sometimes. A single word, betrayal, mercy, shadow, gets tested across a dozen contexts. One day, he throws an entire poem away. Too gentle, he mutters. Might invite misunderstanding. The man delivering these verses, nicknamed Il Postino del Professore, isn't just a smuggler. He's a curator, a cultural attaché of fear. He carries Raffaele's words in a hidden compartment inside his shoe, always with a plastic sleeve in case of rain. He once got stopped by the police. They searched his pockets, even his belt. But they didn't check his heel. When he made it to the rendezvous, he handed the page over with shaking hands. The recipient read the verse twice, kissed the folded corner, and whispered, "He hasn't forgotten me." That's the effect these poems have now. They don't just direct, they decide. One page determines who lives, who ascends, who disappears. Not in a flashy way. There are no boss labels, no capos holding court in smoky basements. The power is quieter, more elegant. That's the brilliance of it. Because how do you prosecute poetry? In fact, prosecutors have tried. In one famous trial, a Cutolo verse was read aloud by a state attorney as evidence. The courtroom chuckled at first, until the second stanza, when the metaphors became razor sharp. When a reference to black honey on the judge's tongue seemed a little too specific, the judge called for a recess. The poem was dismissed as non-incriminating literature, but the unease lingered. Many people still think that Cutolo's greatest power wasn't in leading soldiers, but in making the state unsure whether it was fighting a man or a myth. So what do you think? If a line of poetry can stop a bullet, doesn't that make it more dangerous than a gun? Raphael keeps writing. He pens verses about weather and history, about loyalty and birthright. But hidden within these themes are tiny movements, shifts in policy, silent commands. One poem, distributed across 5 prisons, includes a line, "When the sea turns away from the moon, the fisherman must return home." The next week, a major operation in drug distribution quietly halts. The entire pipeline goes dark. No one asks why. They know better. There's a ritual now. Before major moves, NCO leaders read a verse, like reading tea leaves. They debate what it means. If the language is ambiguous, they send word back to Poggioreale for clarification. Raphael answers with a single word, sometimes a symbol, a drawing of a wave, a number circled in red. One time, just a dried bay leaf. Inside his cell, he keeps all originals. Each poem hand-copied 5, sometimes 10 times. The original always stays with him, filed, numbered, bound in a leather folder a guard once smuggled in as a Bible cover. Technically, not a lie, and still, no one dares confiscate it. Even the prison warden, a by-the-book bureaucrat with no patience for romantic criminals, once told a colleague, "Touch that folder and you'll find yourself in a metaphor you won't escape." The verses themselves aren't always beautiful. Some are jagged, purposefully unclear. He isn't trying to win awards. He's trying to command obedience without saying names. Rosetta still visits, still brings oranges, still tries to talk to him like a brother. "You write too much," she says once. "You forget how to speak like a person." "I remember," he says, "but people forget how to listen." One day she brings a priest, hoping maybe for some redemption. Raphael listens politely, nods through the rosary. When the priest finishes, Cutolo leans in and recites a poem. It's about a man who believes he's drowning, only to realize it's not water, but guilt rising around him. The priest doesn't return. The poetry continues. It's studied now, quietly, in universities. Linguists wonder how someone with barely a secondary education could construct such layered syntax. Some speculate he had help. Others argue he simply understood people better than he let on. One professor writes an essay. Cutolo's verses weaponize metaphor like no other author in Italian criminal history. His genius was not in rhyme, but in rhythm. The rhythm of fear. It circulates among students, then among law enforcement, then among inmates. Back in Poggio Reale, Raphael adds a new poem to his growing collection. It's titled Permission. It ends with this: "A name once spoken becomes a door, but a name unspoken, that's a fortress." They say the state doesn't negotiate with criminals, but in 1981, it does. Somewhere deep inside the grim corridors of Italian government buildings, a quiet desperation brews. Aldo Moro had been assassinated 3 years earlier by the Red Brigades. The scars still haven't healed. So when a regional Christian Democrat, Zero Cirio, is kidnapped by the same group, the fear becomes not just national, but personal. This time, they need him back alive. And someone whispers the name Cutolo. Yes, that Cutolo, the man behind bars, the man who writes in verses and governs from behind concrete, the man who's never held office, but holds influence in places the government never truly reached. It's a surreal idea, turning to a convicted mob boss to mediate with terrorists. But it's Naples. And in Naples, reality has layers. The first signal comes in the form of a lawyer, not officially connected to anyone, of course, just a visitor, a carrier of possibilities. He meets with Cutolo, speaks in vagaries, outlines no deals but mentions stakes. Raphael listens, and then, with unsettling calm, he offers an answer. When the fire is too wild for hands, send the wind. No one knows exactly how, but communication is established. Some say intermediaries from the NCO reach the Red Brigades through mutual acquaintances. Others believe money was offered, untraceable, substantial, and clearly persuasive. But one thing is certain: Ciro Cirillo is released, alive, and the public? Confused. The official narrative doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Whispers multiply. Journalists hint at mafia involvement. Some allege that Cutolo directly negotiated the deal from his cell. Others scoff. How could a prisoner mediate with terrorists? They ask. But those who know, because right after Cirillo's release, Cutolo's reach seems to expand overnight. New construction contracts flow through NCO channels. Political figures soften their tone. In prison, even the most cynical inmates begin to speak of him with a new kind of reverence. not just as a poet or don, but as a man who could move governments from a room with no telephone. Many people still think the Cirillo affair marked the true high point of Cutolo's influence, when the lines between state and syndicate blurred into something far more unsettling. So what do you think? When both sides need each other to survive, is there even a side left to choose? Within weeks, more indirect benefits arrive. One of his trusted lieutenants is transferred to a lower security wing. Another receives reduced charges on a pending case. Coincidence? Maybe. But in the NCO, coincidence is just a word used by people without access. Cutolo drafts a new poem titled "The Room Without Keys." It begins with, "Walls don't listen, but they remember." It circulates subtly. To insiders, it reads like a quiet victory chant, a coded signal that even stone can be softened if you know where to tap. Outside the prison, the press hammers away, hungry for confirmation. No one gives it. No one has to. Naples already believes. Even rival Camorra clans fall silent for a moment. Not because they respect him, but because they realize something chilling. This man doesn't just control crime. He influences crisis. A quiet meeting takes place between two major Camorra bosses in a villa outside Caserta. The topic? How to survive a world where Cutolo's words now carry more weight than their bullets. Inside Poggio Reale, Raffaele is serene, more focused than ever. He writes less poetry and more policy, shorter lines, tighter codes. He begins referring to the NCO's structure as la macchina, the machine, a thing that hums with or without him. That's the goal now. Permanence. He writes in his notebook, "A man dies, a machine waits." Still, not everyone in power is pleased. Elements within the government grow nervous. They realize the message this moment has sent, not just to the public, but to every aspiring criminal in the country, that under the right circumstances, you don't just rise above the law, you become part of it. So quietly, pressure begins to mount. Cutolo is watched more closely. Letters are intercepted, visits are delayed, but nothing truly sticks. Because the thing about poetry is, it's slippery. It's always just one metaphor away from denial. A magistrate once tried to charge him using his verses as evidence. The case collapsed. The judge ruled the poetry too abstract to indicate intent. That same week, the magistrate received an anonymous envelope. Inside, one line handwritten in black ink. Even steel forgets how sharp it is until it's cold again. He requested a transfer the next day. And Raphael? He simply continued. Less noise, more precision. He tells a fellow inmate, "Power isn't the loudest thing in the room. It's the thing that never has to raise its voice." And now, he doesn't need to. The Cirillo affair proved it. When the state panics, it turns to the very shadows it claims to fight. Cutolo doesn't gloat. He doesn't even write about it publicly. He lets the silence do the work. Because the silence now wears his signature, there's a fog over Naples in the spring of 1981, the kind that clings to shutters and slows everything to a hush. But inside the Italian government's corridors, the air is sharper, taut with unease, because the Cirillo deal is unraveling faster than anyone can bury it. Too many people are talking, too many journalists asking questions no one wants to answer. And in the middle of it all, behind concrete and steel, Raffaele Cutolo is calm, unbothered. In fact, he seems amused. Word reaches him that his name has been mentioned again in the national parliament, not as a suspect, but as a symptom. One lawmaker refers to him as Italy's unacknowledged negotiator. Another, less poetic, calls him the shame we whispered into power. Raphael's reply? A poem slipped through prison corridors and into the hands of a courier. It reads, "They asked the lion to open the cage, then blamed him for remembering his teeth." And just like that, Cutolo's legend deepens. But inside the NCO, something else is shifting. The deal, the Cirillo affair, has painted a target on his back, not just from the state, but from within. His visibility is becoming a liability. Old allies begin to question whether this spotlight is brilliance, or the first step toward collapse. Cutolo senses it. He becomes more private, more cryptic. Communications grow tighter. Even long-time lieutenants receive fewer words, less warmth. His poetry takes on a colder edge. Where once he wrote about loyalty and myth, now he writes about erosion, about wind whittling stone, about names fading faster than echoes. He pens a verse called The Banquet. It describes a grand table where each guest brings a blade, and no one dares eat first. It's not hard to decode. The NCO's cohesion is beginning to crack. Historically, this is the beginning of the end for Cutolo's iron grip. The state is still slow, still unsure, but his rivals are not. Other Camorra clans, those he humiliated, absorbed, or ignored, begin quietly rallying. They form new alliances, share information, trade resentment like currency. Many people still think that if Cutolo hadn't involved himself in the Cirillo deal, the NCO would have lasted much longer. So what do you think? Is power truly power if it can't survive the spotlight? Back in Poggioreale, Raffaele is moved discreetly to another facility, Asinara. It's a prison island off the coast of Sardinia, isolated, stark, nicknamed the Alcatraz of Italy. The message is clear. The state doesn't just want to contain him now. It wants to silence him. He arrives by boat, handcuffed, eyes steady, wind slicing through his coat. The guards don't speak. The warden doesn't greet him. The cell is smaller, colder, fewer visitors. No theater here, and yet Cutolo adjusts. He writes less often, but when he does, the words cut deeper. They're distilled. No wasted flourishes, no lyrical detours. One poem, barely 4 lines, reaches Naples and spreads like spilled ink. When the king eats alone, the knives stay clean, but listen to the plates. They still whisper betrayal. It's reprinted in a tabloid, then dissected by sociologists. Who's the king? Who's holding the knives? Who's not at the table anymore? Inside Asinara, Raphael develops new routines. He walks in tight circles, muttering lines under his breath. He builds imaginary tables in his mind, rearranges names, crosses them out. He receives fewer messages now, fewer poems from loyalists. Some have been arrested, others disappeared. A few switched sides, but Rosetta still writes, always. Her letters remain steady, kind, concerned. She tells him about the birds in Ottaviano, about the neighbors who still ask about him in hushed tones. She tells him that his name is being misused, and that maybe it's time to stop writing. He responds with a single sheet. I don't write to speak. I write to listen back. In one chilling moment, a fellow inmate in Asinara passes him in the yard and mutters, "They say they're coming for you, Raffaele." He stops walking. Then, I've been waiting for someone worth the poetry, but the words no longer flow like they used to. The poetry comes in fits, like a faucet, half frozen. His pen shakes sometimes. The metaphors turn brittle. Even he can feel it. The erosion of myth. One day, he writes a piece titled Loyalty's Shadow. It begins with, "The crown remembers who placed it, but forgets who held it steady." He doesn't show it to anyone. Outside, the NCO is bleeding. Territories once loyal begin breaking away. Old enemies resurface with fresh alliances. Streets once sealed tight are now battlegrounds again. And the young recruits? They're quoting new voices now. No more O Professore. No more verses about honor. Now it's cash, speed, silence. The poetry still floats in the air, but it's diluted, like smoke that's been rained on. And yet, Raphael writes one last poem that month. The paper barely holds the ink. It reads, "I taught them songs. They remembered the rhythm, but not the reason." The war starts quietly. It doesn't explode all at once. There's no trumpet, no shot heard round the alleys. But if you're listening, if you know how to read the silence, it's already begun. In the outskirts of Naples, 2 former NCO lieutenants disappear within a week of each other. One is found in a ravine, his hands still clasped as if praying. The other is never found at all, but a verse is left spray-painted on the wall near his last known address. When the mirror breaks, it remembers who last looked. No signature, but everyone knows. This is the beginning of the Camorra Civil War. For years, Cutolo's word was law, his poetry, the constitution of Naples' underworld. But now, his words echo in a vacuum. The streets no longer respond to them like they once did. The NCO, once a finely tuned mechanism of fear and rhythm, is grinding. Outside, rival clans have grown bolder. The Nuova Camorra, an alliance of old-school bosses and ambitious upstarts, has begun to challenge every piece of territory Cutolo once ruled without setting foot there. It's not just a rebellion, it's a purge. In prisons across Campania, fights break out. Affiliates of the NCO are isolated, jumped, shivved. Guards turn blind eyes. Old alliances turn cold. Letters to Cutolo are intercepted, or worse, burned. He feels the shift before he reads about it. He starts sleeping less. He writes faster. The poems become erratic, less measured, more like spells cast out of desperation. One morning, a guard finds him sitting on the floor of his cell, surrounded by torn pages. The only line still legible. Even kings fear the silence between applause. The guard doesn't ask what it means. He just locks the door and walks away more slowly than usual. Many people still think that Cutolo's failure wasn't arrogance, but scale. That by building something so large, so poetic, he forgot that empires eventually develop their own vocabulary. So, what do you think? Can any language, no matter how lyrical, outlive the people who believe in it? The Nuova Camorra isn't poetic, it's methodical. Led by a network of traditionalist bosses, Michel Zaza, Carmine Alfieri, the Giuliano clan, they deal in bullets and bribes, not verses. Their message is blunt. Cutolo is over. His empire is finished. Anyone still loyal will end up in a grave or on trial. One by one, NCO territories fall. A bakery in Forcella that once paid dues to O Professore switches allegiance after a brief visit. A construction site in Casoria halts all payments to Cutolo's people. The workers say they weren't threatened. They just received a new number to call. Inside Asanara, Raffaele hears about this through code. Letters that used to arrive every other day now come once a week. Then, every 2. One contains a newspaper clipping about a former ally found face down in a canal. Cutolo reads it once, folds it neatly, and slides it under his mattress. He writes less. When he does write, the words taste different. Not bitter, hollow. He pens a piece titled, "The Voice That Left Too Early." It reads like a farewell to something he hasn't yet admitted is dying. Meanwhile, the Italian government watches. They're not sad to see the NCO fracturing. In fact, they assist when they can. Wiretaps, secret deals, reduced sentences for defectors. The system that once courted Cutolo during the Cirillo crisis now quietly dismantles his legacy one leniency at a time. The betrayal comes from within, too. A lieutenant, trusted, long time, hand-picked, flips. He testifies in court, revealing internal codes, financial paths, even the meaning behind specific verses. He would tell us everything through the poetry, he says. Sometimes we had to read it aloud 3 times to understand who was being marked. When Raphael hears about the testimony, he says nothing for almost an entire day. Just sits by his bunk, staring out the window, lips moving without sound. The next poem he writes is scrawled in the margins of a torn newspaper. It says, "The blade closest to the neck is the one you sharpened yourself." Rosetta visits again. She notices how gaunt he looks, how quiet. Not the thoughtful silence she's used to, but the kind that smells like defeat. He still writes, but the notebook stays closed on the table during their visit. He tells her the food tastes like paper, and the prayers don't land the way they used to. She offers to pray for him more. He smiles faintly. "Pray for the echoes. I think they're lonelier than I am." By winter, the NCO is a shell. Some cells still hold out, loyal more to memory than to strategy. But the streets have changed. The rhythms are different. The fear doesn't chant anymore. It stabs. A funeral is held for a former affiliate. No NCO members attend. No poems are recited. Just a plain wooden casket and the sound of rain against umbrellas. Cutolo gets the news days later. He writes nothing. Instead, he stares at his folder of old verses, the archive, the legacy. He leafs through them slowly. Some are smudged. Some copied so many times they're no longer legible. Some lines still make him pause, and then he pulls one page out. The first, the one that started it all, O Cormio. He reads it aloud. No one hears it but the walls. The walls of Asinara are different. They don't echo the way Poggioreale did. They swallow sound. Thoughts disappear into them like coins into deep water. No splash, no return. Raffaele Cutolo knows this now. And maybe, in a way, he prefers it. There's no one left to perform for. The war has burned past him. The streets of Naples, once set to the rhythm of his words, now hum to a harsher, newer beat. The NCO has fractured beyond recognition. The newer bosses don't cite poetry. They don't recite oaths. They issue ultimatums, and they don't say his name. That's what bothers him most. Not the betrayal, not the fading power, but the silence. He walks slower now. Not from age, not yet. From weight. The kind that poems can't carry. He keeps his rituals, though. Wakes early. Washes his face with cold water. Reads old verses like prayers. They still hold meaning, but the meaning has shifted. Like a once sharp shadow stretched across dusk. Familiar, but distant. One morning, he receives a letter from a name he doesn't recognize. A teenager. Just 15. "They say you wrote like a soldier with no war," the boy writes. "Can you teach me how to hold words like a weapon?" Cutolo doesn't respond, but he keeps the letter. Many people still think that Cutolo's exile in Asinara was meant to erase him, not just contain him. So what do you think? Can a myth survive when its audience stops repeating the lines? He begins drafting fewer poems now, but the ones he writes are quieter, heavier. Less thunder, more gravity. One poem, never sent, is simply titled Rehearsal. It goes, "We practiced greatness in rooms too small for anyone to notice." He folds it 3 times and tucks it into the lining of his jacket. No one ever sees it again. Visitors are rare now. Rosetta comes when she can, but age is pulling her toward stillness. When she does visit, she brings fewer oranges, more silence. They sit together and say little. He watches her hands. She watches his eyes. At one point, she asks, "Do you still believe they needed you?" Raffaele doesn't answer right away. Then, "No, but they needed someone to believe." She nods, says nothing more. Outside, Italy is shifting. The mafia trials are mounting. The state is growing teeth. Pentiti, former mafiosi turned informants, line courtrooms. And Cutolo, the man who once moved pieces from a prison cell like a maestro, is suddenly passé. No one quotes him in court anymore. His name doesn't scare like it used to. But in a small corner of a Neapolitan school, a teacher hands out a photocopied poem, anonymous, listed only as "a voice from Asinara." The students are told it's an exercise in subtext. One boy raises his hand and asks, "Why is it so sad?" The teacher, unsure how to answer, says, "Because I think he forgot how to end it." Back on the island, Raffaele rereads that same poem for the third time in a week. He considers changing the last line, but doesn't. It ends with, "If a name is never spoken again, was it ever written?" He begins organizing his papers. He knows what comes next. Not execution. He's already survived too much for that. But a kind of slow undoing. The disintegration of myth. Not in fire, but in filing cabinets. Forgotten folders. Dust. He writes out instructions for how he wants his notebooks preserved. One guard, confused, asks, "Preserved for what?" "For whoever rewrites this," Raffaele says. "Someday, someone always does. The sunsets on Asinara are beautiful, wide, unearned, and indifferent. Raffaele watches them sometimes from his window. He writes fewer lines now, but longer ones. One poem, perhaps his last, goes, "Let them take the guns, the cities, the fear. I will keep the pause between words, the silence no one could ever use correctly but me." It doesn't reach anyone. He doesn't send it. But that night, he sleeps better than usual. For once, he dreams without metaphors. A soft rain falls on Asinara, brushing against the window like it's asking to be let in. Raffaele Cutolo lies on his cot, blanket pulled to his chest, eyes half closed but not sleeping. He hasn't slept well in weeks, not from nightmares, but from the absence of them. There's nothing left to outrun in dreams. His cell is quieter than usual, not because it's empty, but because the noise inside his head, the poetry, the machinery, the maps, has slowed to a hush. He hasn't written in days. The last thing he wrote wasn't a poem, not really. It was a list. Names of men he once trusted. Some dead, some vanished. A few still walking the streets with other allegiances. He crossed out each one with a line so clean it looked surgical. Then he folded the paper into a square and placed it behind a loose brick near the sink. He no longer expects anyone to find it. The days blend together. Meals, walks, check-ins. A nurse visits once a week to check his pressure. She calls him Signor Cutolo, never Professore. He doesn't correct her. One morning, a guard brings him an envelope. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of notebook paper, torn at the edges. Just 3 words. Still listening. Always. He smiles, but only for a second. Later, he paces the room and hums a tune no one else knows. It's something from his childhood. Half lullaby, half street song. He once rewrote the lyrics to that tune for a poem he never finished. The melody lingers longer than the words now. Many people still think that what broke Cutolo in the end wasn't isolation or power lost, but the fact that his own words outlived their meaning. So, what do you think? Can a poet survive once the world stops reading? The island wind creeps through the window's edge. It carries with it the salt of the sea, the scent of driftwood, and something else. Stillness. He walks to the tiny metal desk and opens his last notebook. Blank pages stare up at him, waiting. But he doesn't write. He just runs his finger over the paper, as if remembering what ink used to feel like. Then finally he sits and writes 4 lines. They are not his best. They are not his worst. They are simply enough. Some voices weren't made for applause, just quiet rooms where someone still listens. He tears out the page, folds it slowly, and places it beneath his pillow. That night, for the first time in years, he doesn't dream about Naples, or war, or marble tables set for betrayal. He dreams of orange peels in his mother's kitchen, of Rosetta humming a hymn, of the way silence used to be something he wore, not something he drowned in. And as he exhales into the dark, the island wind answers back, not with fury or threat, but with something gentler, a kind of hush, a kind of goodbye. The machine has stopped, the poetry has rested, and the man, he fades, not with a scream, not with a trial, not even with a poem, just a breath, just a silence, just a final line that doesn't need to be recited. So here, dear listener, let us pause. Let's leave the concrete walls of Asinara behind. Let the sound of the sea carry us softly back into ourselves, back from codes and verses and the heavy hush of a man who once ruled through silence. Close your eyes now and imagine the world he left, a world quieter than before, where the poetry stopped echoing and the ink dried slowly under a softer sky. You've walked through alleys slick with rain and power, sat in courtrooms where words curled like smoke, and stepped inside a prison cell where a pen weighed more than any pistol. But now it's time to step away from the myth. Let the names blur. Let the pages close. Because what remains isn't fear or loyalty or even legacy. What remains is a stillness, a slow exhale. The steady comfort of knowing that for all his shadows, Raffaele Cutolo was just a man with paper, ink, and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, was still listening. So tonight, if your thoughts drift toward cold marble cells or whispered verses, let them pass like clouds. Let your mind soften. Let your heartbeat fall into a slower rhythm. You're safe now. The stories are done, and even the strongest myths eventually go to sleep. Good night. Back in Naples, the name Cutolo still lingers, but differently now. It floats, not like thunder, but like fog. Present, diffused, impossible to grasp. The streets he once ruled with metaphor and fear have moved on, if not entirely forward. Graffiti that once quoted his lines has been scrubbed away or painted over with football slogans and teenage names. But every now and then, someone finds a wall untouched, faded, just visible enough to read, "Obedience wears no chains, only a crown too heavy for liars." And they wonder, in the courthouse archives, file boxes bear his name, testimonies, surveillance transcripts, confiscated letters, most of them yellowed, their edges curling like leaves in late autumn. Prosecutors from a newer generation look over them like artifacts, half curious, half weary. In universities, a handful of sociology students still write papers on the NCO. Some argue that Cutolo was a sociopathic manipulator. Others say he was a necessary consequence of a broken system. One student calls him Italy's cruelest librarian, cataloging loyalty and betrayal with chilling syntax. None of them quite agree, but they all cite the same poem, the one about the king who dines alone. Meanwhile, in a neighborhood bar in Casoria, 2 old men talk over coffee. One used to collect for the NCO. The other was a cousin to a lieutenant. Their talk turns inevitably to "Oh, Professore, remember when his words were like thunder?" one says. "Now they're just echoes," the other replies. But still, echoes carry. Many people still think Cutolo's greatest strength wasn't building a criminal empire, but convincing others that language could hold power in its barest form. So what do you think? Is a whisper more dangerous when people lean in to hear it? Elsewhere in the city, the children of former affiliates grow up in two kinds of silence: the kind their families enforce at home, and the kind the world has imposed. Some ask questions, others never do. A few even find old verses tucked into books or drawers, written in looping script they can't quite decipher. One young woman, a university student, finds such a note in her late uncle's things. It reads, "A name shouted is a risk. A name whispered is a ritual." She doesn't know who wrote it, but she keeps it. Back in Ottaviano, Rosetta lives alone now, quietly. A small apartment near the church. The nuns visit sometimes, bring her food, ask how she's feeling. She never speaks about her brother unless someone asks directly. Even then, her answers are gentle, brief. "He believed in rules," she says once, "but he couldn't save himself with them." On Sundays, she lights a candle and sits in the third pew from the back. No one knows who she prays for anymore, but they let her be. In a small box by her bedside, she keeps the last letter Raphael ever wrote to her. It ends with, "Forgive the man, forget the name, remember the silence. It kept me company when nothing else could." Back on the mainland, a police officer retires. In his home, tucked between photo albums, is a single sheet of paper, the first verse Cutolo ever published from inside Poggio Reale. "O cor mio," the officer never turned it in, said it reminded him that even monsters can sound beautiful if you only read the first line. And in Asanara, the cell remains, cleaned out, walls freshly painted. No trace of the man who once imagined empires into being from behind those bars. But late one evening, during a routine inspection, a guard finds a small folded page lodged behind the radiator. It reads, "If you found this, you know how to listen. Now forget the voice and keep the silence." In the years that follow Cutolo's quiet descent, the Camorra evolves, but not in the way he envisioned. Gone are the formalities, the rituals, the verses folded like treaties. The new generation trades stanzas for speed. Orders come through burner phones now, not poetry. Loyalty is measured in profit margins, not metaphors. They don't wear uniforms. They don't recite oaths. They don't quote O Professore, but strangely, they don't erase him either. In a warehouse in Portici, during a police raid, authorities discover an abandoned office. Inside, shipping manifests, burner SIM cards, unregistered weapons, and one weathered notebook. Tucked into the cover is a faded clipping of one of Cutolo's poems. No one claims ownership, but someone kept it. This quiet persistence, this thread of echo, is Cutolo's last weapon. His verses have outlived the hierarchy they once commanded, not through fear, but through memory. Many people still think that no matter how fast crime evolves, it never fully escapes its storytellers. So what do you think? Can a ghost continue shaping a world even when no one speaks its name aloud? Back in Naples, an ambitious journalist digs into the archives. She's heard whispers of Cutolo's coded laws, a mythical rule book passed down through shadows. What she finds are fragments, poems cited in old court records, half-translated letters, marginalia in old notebooks seized in raids. She begins compiling them. Not for law enforcement, for publication. Her editor hesitates. "You're glorifying him," he says. "I'm documenting how fear learned to rhyme," she replies. The book is eventually published. Verses in the Void, the language of power in the words of Raffaele Cutolo. It receives academic attention. Literary circles debate its ethics. One reviewer calls it a mirror held up to the darkest corners of charisma. Cutolo, of course, never sees it, but Rosetta does. She's older now, slower, but still steady. She reads it in one sitting, then places it beside a candle and whispers something only she understands. Then she closes the book and doesn't touch it again. In a Neapolitan prison, a young inmate reads that same book during mandatory library time. He doesn't say anything, but he copies one line onto the wall beside his bed. "We don't own men, we borrow their fear." A guard spots it, doesn't remove it. Instead, he draws a quiet line under it in pencil. Just once. Elsewhere, a former NCO affiliate, long retired, now a grandfather, sits on a balcony in Salerno. His grandson asks what he used to do before he owned the corner cafe. The old man sips espresso, gazes at the sea, then recites from memory. "A traitor dies once, the loyal a little each day." The boy doesn't understand. Not yet, but he remembers it. Because even now, in softened whispers, in hallways where echoes stretch thin, Raffaele Cutolo's voice flickers. In schools, he's a case study. In prisons, a faded mural. In courtrooms, a precedent. And in the hidden places, the notebooks, the margins, the folds behind picture frames, he's a reminder that sometimes the sharpest power is the one that never shouts. His poems are no longer orders. They're fossils, but fossils still tell stories, and stories, when they're written deep enough, don't ask to be remembered. They just wait. Time, even in Naples, has a way of dulling the edge of legends. The name Cutolo begins to feel like it belongs to another century. A chapter turned, a ghost dismissed with a shrug. But every so often, something surfaces, a wiretap transcript, a whispered reference during a plea deal, a verse half repeated in the wrong voice at the wrong time. The police call it residue. The poets might call it residue too. In a basement beneath an old pizzeria near San Giovanni a Teduccio, investigators uncover a cache of documents. Not cash, not weapons, just papers, poems, dozens of them. Handwritten, typed, photocopied, some preserved, others browned with age, all with one signature at the bottom. RC. They aren't dated. Some appear to be early drafts of well-known verses, others completely unfamiliar. A few are so cryptic they border on surreal. The wind forgets where it starts, but the dust never does. They hand them to experts, linguists, criminologists, historians. No one agrees on their authenticity. One thing's clear. Someone still considers these valuable enough to protect, to hide, to revisit, even as the modern Camorra operates in slicker, bloodier terms. Euro transfers, digital rackets, low-profile assassins. The idea of Cutolo's written laws lingers like perfume in an empty room. You can't see it, but you know it's there. One NCO survivor, now working in construction under an assumed name, tells a journalist in confidence they stopped quoting him when the guns got louder. But the structure, the bones, they're still his. That same week, a school teacher in Naples leads her students through a lesson on propaganda. She plays an old recording, a grainy courtroom audio clip of Raphael speaking in defense of his own myth. He says, "I don't build soldiers. I build men who remember what silence owes them." The students are too young to know who he is. But one girl writes the line down anyway. Later, she tapes it to the back of her notebook. Rosetta, now in her final years, has moved to a small hospice near the hills. She rarely speaks. Nurses say she hums to herself sometimes, religious hymns. But once, as a storm passes outside, one nurse hears her murmur, "We thought poems were prayers." She says nothing else that night. Cutolo's name briefly returns to headlines when an old trial is reopened. A former associate claims he has documents proving that Professore was in contact with high-level politicians during the 1980s. The press revisits the Cirillo affair. The articles buzz for a week, then fade. No verdict, no conclusion, just the same old silence. Many people still think that if Italy's institutions had been stronger, there would have been no Cutolo, no NCO, no verses etched in prison walls. So what do you think? Do monsters make themselves? Or do we leave the lights off too long and let them shape themselves in the dark? At Asanara, his former cell is now used as storage. Blankets, boxes, old light bulbs. But on the inside of a pipe beneath the window, scratched faintly into the rust, is one last message. I only spoke because the silence was too afraid. A guard finds it during maintenance. He copies it into a notebook, closes it, and doesn't tell anyone. Cutolo dies quietly, years later, in a hospital bed under a false name. No fanfare, no bodyguards, just a nurse holding his hand because someone should. She doesn't know who he is. She just hears him whisper something before he goes. She never repeats it. But she does remember how calm he looked, like a man who had nothing more to prove. In Naples, the news reports his death with a short article. Raffaele Cutolo, 79, former Camorra boss, dies in hospital. No pictures, no interviews, no riots. Just a comment beneath the article, posted anonymously. His poems were better than his crimes. That's all that's left. A name, a few verses, and a silence that still knows how to hold its breath after the obituary fades into digital dust and the headlines move on to newer names. Naples doesn't mark the death of Raffaele Cutolo with any parade. No shrine, no protest. Just the continued breathing of a city that's learned to live with ghosts in its walls. Still, a few signs remain. On a cracked bench near the Mergellina seafront, someone has carved a familiar phrase into the wood. You can lock the man, but not the echo. No one claims it. No one paints over it. In the back of a small cafe in the Quartieri Spagnoli, a man in his 40s runs his fingers over the spine of a worn-out book. It's not poetry. It's court transcripts. But tucked between the pages is a folded note. 4 lines written in blue ink. Even when forgotten, the whisper waits. It wears no watch, but always knows the hour. The man reads it, sighs, then tucks it away again like a photo of someone he used to be. He doesn't talk about the NCO anymore, but he never says it didn't happen. That's the thing with legends. You don't need to believe them entirely. You just need to remember they were once believed. In prison corridors, the Cutolo myth has shriveled, but not vanished. New inmates learn his name the way you learn about an old, unfashionable uncle, someone you've heard stories about, but never really met. They don't idolize him. They reference him. You're trying to run things like you're Cutolo. One inmate mocks another during a dispute. The other fires back. Cutolo's dead. So are his poems. Maybe. But in another wing, a different inmate recites a line before a fistfight. The storm doesn't ask for permission. And that's the thing. The words never really belonged to Cutolo. Not anymore. They belong to the air now. The culture. A mythology that Naples, whether proudly or reluctantly, still carries. At the university, a new professor builds a seminar called Language and Crime in the 20th Century. Cutolo gets an entire lecture, not because he was the most violent or the most successful, but because he understood something too few do. Power isn't always in the act. Sometimes it's in how the act is described. And while most mafiosi live in headlines or footnotes, Cutolo lived in cadence. Rosetta dies not long after her brother. Her funeral is small, modest. A few nuns, one distant cousin. The priest says her soul was steady, a woman of patience, of faith, and perhaps of forgiveness. No mention of her brother, but someone, no one knows who, leaves a single piece of paper on her grave. Folded neatly, a line written in elegant, old handwriting. She prayed louder than I ever spoke. No one moves it. The rain eventually melts the ink, but the sentiment lingers. In a quiet archive room in Rome, a historian opens a sealed box labeled NCO Internal Writings, 1978-1982. She's not expecting much. Maybe some ledgers, maybe fragments of letters. But what she finds are poems, dozens, some signed, some not, some crossed out halfway through, as if the writer had second thoughts, as if even monsters question their metaphors. She reads them, page by page, line by line, not for evidence, but for understanding, because, as she notes later in her journal, even when the crimes are gone, the cadence remains. And in that rhythm, we find the map of how power learned to speak. The map doesn't end in blood. It ends in quiet, in a single room, with a man and a pen, and the belief that if you wrote the right line, someone, somewhere, might not forget you. In the heart of Naples, tucked between shuttered buildings and laundry lines heavy with late sunlight, a narrow alley still carries a faint echo of a time when verses ruled more than love songs. A boy, 14, wiry, too observant for his own good, walks through it every day on his way to school. He doesn't know much about the Camorra. Not really. His parents don't talk about it. His teachers avoid it. But one day, he sees something etched into the plaster of a wall behind an old fruit stall. When silence becomes a name, it never forgets who called it first. No signature, no context, but the words stay with him. He doesn't know why. That boy will grow up, leave Naples, maybe even forget that verse. But years later, in a city far from the Mediterranean, he'll hear a rhythm in a song, or see a line of poetry in a train station, and it will come back, like smoke curling through the vents of memory. Because echoes don't vanish, they wait. Meanwhile, in a prison library, 200 miles from where Cutolo once paced the floors of Poggioreale, a new inmate checks out a book titled I versi del vuoto, the verses of the void. He doesn't know who Cutolo was, but the preface catches him. To write under walls is to build without permission. He copies the line into a notebook of his own. He starts writing, not for power, not for loyalty, but just to hear himself think. He doesn't join a gang. He doesn't pick a side. But something in those lines gives him space. And that space grows. In a city archive in Caserta, a researcher finds a tape recording mislabeled as Cultural Interview 1980. She plays it. The voice is unmistakable. Calm, low, rehearsed. Cutolo, speaking not to a courtroom, not to a guard, but to the tape itself. He's asked, "Do you believe you've made a difference?" He waits 3 long seconds, then, "No, I believe I gave others the language to pretend they did." It's chilling, but not entirely untrue. Many people still think that Raffaele Cutolo's greatest invention wasn't the NCO, or the charter, or even the verses. It was the idea that power could be poetic, that the right words, in the right moment, were sharper than any blade. So what do you think? If history forgets your crimes but remembers your cadence, does that make you innocent or immortal? In Ottaviano, a local museum curator debates whether to include Cutolo in an exhibit on Naples' criminal past. They worry about glamorizing him, romanticizing evil. But they also know the absence of his story leaves a hole bigger than any myth. They settle for a compromise, a dimly lit display. One photo, a facsimile of a poem behind glass. No commentary, no praise, just this title. Echoes from a locked room. Visitors pause. Some linger. One tourist from Milan stares for a long time, then mutters to her friend, "He should have written novels." Her friend replies, "He did. He just used people instead of paper." Back in Asanara, the cell remains sealed, the desk untouched. A faint ring remains on the surface where a candle once burned low every night. A single pencil mark on the wall, horizontal, just above shoulder height. Not a message, just a presence. A guard walks past, doesn't speak. But in his mind, a phrase returns. We die once, but we echo for those still listening. It's not written anywhere, but he knows whose line it was, and that, even in silence, Raffaele Cutolo is still whispering. Somewhere in Palermo, in the corner of a smoky cafe where old men play cards under flickering lights, a familiar debate rekindles itself without prompting. "Cutolo was never one of us," says a gruff voice, tossing down a losing hand. "He played theater, not blood, but he made blood listen," replies another, stirring his espresso slowly. "That's more dangerous. They don't say his name again. They don't have to, because Raffaele Cutolo, even in absence, still divides rooms. His story is no longer told in chronological order. It arrives in fragments, half-remembered trials, faded interviews, verses quoted without attribution. He exists now the way myths do, as needed. A social media page devoted to criminal history posts a black and white photo of him. Young, sharp-eyed, in a courtroom, half-smile hiding a dagger of thought. The caption reads, "The poet who built a kingdom behind bars." The comments erupt. Some glorify him, others curse his name. But the post racks up thousands of views, and someone, beneath all the noise, comments, "My grandfather still has one of his poems. It's tucked in the back of a mirror." At a university in Milan, a student-led production stages a theatrical adaptation of his early writings. They call it Versi sotto le spara, verses under the bars. It plays to a sold-out crowd. Critics are divided. One praises the language. Another writes, "You cannot romanticize violence just because it rhymes," and yet the audience claps longer than expected. Back in Naples, a police officer in training flips through an old file. Cutolo's name is stamped across the top. He's never read the full dossier before, just whispers of it during lectures. The officer pauses at a page, a handwritten note, once intercepted during a prison raid. It reads, "We taught fear to rhyme. Now it sings without us." He doesn't know if it's real or forged, but he copies it into his notes anyway, because real or not, it sounds true. Many people still think that Cutolo's legacy is dangerous, precisely because it blurs the line between criminal and creator. So what do you think? Is it better to be remembered for destruction, or for how beautifully you explained it? Rosetta's apartment remains untouched since her passing. Her modest belongings are boxed by the convent. Among the rosaries and prayer cards, they find a single tape recorder. Inside, one cassette, labeled, "To be played only if he is forgotten." No one knows what's on it. No one dares press play. In a tattoo parlor in Barcelona, a young man gets a line inked across his ribs. It reads, "Loyalty is just memory, told to wait." He says it's from a Neapolitan writer. Can't remember who. Doesn't really care. He just liked how it sounded when his brother whispered it before disappearing. At a correctional facility in Puglia, an inmate writes his first poem. He doesn't know how to structure it. It's clumsy, raw. But he ends it with a line, "If you don't speak, the silence will choose for you." He submits it to the prison newsletter under the pseudonym RC. The warden frowns when he reads it. He's heard that signature before, but says nothing, because some names don't vanish. They just sink a little deeper into the architecture, the language, the rhythm of institutions built to deny they ever mattered. Cutolo's empire is gone. His men are either buried, broken, or retired behind new names in quiet shops. But his words, they still knock. Not loudly, just enough. The cell is empty now. Cutolo's possessions, what little he had, were boxed up after his death. A few books, a handful of letters, one pencil stub worn to the bone, and the notebooks, of course, dozens of them, most untouched since the late 90s, some blank, some filled with verses that trail off midline, like he forgot what he was saying, or worse, knew it didn't matter anymore. They're all in storage now, numbered, sealed, forgotten with a kind of professionalism. But dust doesn't judge, it just gathers. In the silence that followed his death, no one came forward to claim the archive. No relatives, no former lieutenants, no academic institutions. The state considered destroying the material, then quietly shelved it under restricted cultural sensitivity. It sits in a basement 3 floors beneath a government building in Rome, filed between tax audits and confiscated art. Every few years, someone stumbles across it. A clerk, a researcher, once a cleaning crew. They leaf through a few pages, raise an eyebrow, and whisper the same thing. He wrote all this. He did. Every stanza, every page, every quiet command hidden beneath metaphor. The NCO may have died with its soldiers, but the ink remains. One guard at Asanara swore he once saw Cutolo speaking to himself late at night, reading aloud to the walls. Not in prayer, not in madness, in memory, as if he was keeping the words warm, just in case someone returned to listen. Because even when the streets stopped quoting him, even when the court stopped fearing him, he never stopped writing. It was never just strategy, it was sanctuary. And now, his verses live in strange places, unlikely hands. A poetry zine in Turin accidentally reprints one of his early works under the title Anonymous, 1980s. It receives praise for its stark beauty. A rapper in Palermo samples one of his phrases in a track about betrayal. When asked about the line in an interview, he shrugs. It's just something my uncle used to say. In a chapel in Vico Equense, a priest includes one of Cutolo's final lines in a homily, not knowing the origin. Even a blade rusts if there's no one left to fear it. The congregation murmurs in appreciation. No one asks where the line came from. That's the power of a name that's become something else. In a prison classroom, a literature teacher reads aloud a poem found in an old inmate's diary. The students listen closely. One asks, "Was this written by someone famous?" The teacher hesitates, then answers, "Once." Cutolo's myth no longer walks in broad daylight. It moves like mist, threading through language, tone, timing, not as a man or even a movement, but a rhythm. That's the cruel genius of his legacy. He didn't just build a structure, he taught the structure how to whisper. And now, in offices, in prisons, in fading corners of Naples, the whisper persists. Not loud, not dangerous, just familiar. A presence that doesn't need to be named anymore, because sometimes the most enduring influence isn't the one carved in stone. It's the one scribbled in the margins, folded, hidden, and passed hand to hand long after the man is gone. They never tore down the old prison walls. Poggio Reale still stands, less a fortress now than a relic, part museum, part bureaucracy, still housing stories in its bricks. It's cleaner these days, more cameras, less noise, but some parts remain unchanged. One wing, sealed off from daily use, is occasionally toured by scholars and journalists. It's unofficially known as the Professor's Corridor. No plaque, no memorial. Just a hallway where too many men once recited verses before carrying out unspoken tasks. A guide, bored and young, walks through the corridor with a small group. He points to a flaking wall. Here's where Cutolo used to pass messages, not with phones, with poetry. Someone in the group chuckles. That's ridiculous. The guide shrugs. Maybe, but no one ever ignored him. And that's the thing. Whether you liked him, feared him, or wanted him gone, you couldn't pretend he wasn't there. Even the walls still remember. A faded line remains, scratched beneath layers of painted plaster. The quiet ones don't need to shout. They've already been heard. No one can bring themselves to paint over it. Across town, in a courtroom repurposed for civil disputes, a judge keeps a small quote framed on his desk. It reads, "Truth is the name you say when no one's around to hear it." He's never told anyone who wrote it, not out of shame, but because it's easier to let the words float free than anchor them to the weight of history. Rosetta's belongings, stored in an attic above the convent, are being sorted by hand. Among the prayer books and carefully folded scarves, a sealed envelope is discovered. Inside, a letter from Raphael. Undated. It's short, almost unfinished, as if he began writing and stopped halfway through a thought. If I could go back, I'd still write. But I'd write for her, not for them. The sister assigned to sort the box doesn't know who her is. She assumes a mother or a first love. She places the letter in a small envelope and labels it simply unsent elsewhere in Italy. A theater company prepares a stage piece. Minimalist. Monologues. Shadow play. The theme. The prisoner's voice. One section, titled Il silenzio del poeta, is built around a poem Cutolo is believed to have written in the final year of his life. It goes, I taught silence how to breathe. Now it walks without me. The actor reads it softly in near darkness. The audience leans in, unsure if what they're hearing is fiction or confession, and maybe that's the point. Many people still think Cutolo died in disgrace, stripped of power, lost in the bureaucracy of time. Others believe he died exactly how he wanted, faded into myth, where the details no longer matter. So what do you think? If a man builds a kingdom with metaphors, and the kingdom falls, but the metaphors survive, did he really lose? In an alley behind an elementary school, someone spray paints a verse overnight. Names are graves, echoes are survivors. The school removes it the next morning, but a teacher, quietly, writes it down before they do, because that's how myth works in the end. Not with shouts or salutes, but with someone, somewhere, remembering a line they shouldn't, and passing it along anyway. It's late autumn in Ottaviano. The leaves fall slow and brittle, and the sky holds a color that could be dusk or dawn, depending on how you squint at it. The town doesn't speak Cutolo's name much anymore, but it doesn't need to. He's still there, in the way older shopkeepers lock their cash drawers, in the way children are told not to linger near certain alleyways, in the way the church bells sound louder than they really are, like they're trying to talk over something. Outside the town's library, there's a new mural, part of a local initiative to celebrate Neapolitan literature. Dante, Serrao, Saviano, faces bold and stylized, painted in colors too vibrant for the worn brick. Tucked in the corner, barely noticeable unless you know what to look for, is a stenciled line of text. Ink dries faster when it's hiding something. No attribution, no flourish, just there. Some locals want it removed. Others say to leave it. The mural stays. In a nearby archive, a journalist rifles through a box labeled 1981 Camorra Trials. Her hands move quickly. Notes, recordings, photos, transcripts. But then she finds a small cassette. No label, just black plastic and a strip of aging magnetic tape. She finds an old player, presses play. A voice, calm, familiar to those who've studied it. It's Cutolo, mid-sentence, during a rare interview granted in his early 40s. He's asked what he regrets most. He answers slowly, not what I built, just how many people thought it needed me. The tape clicks. She replays it twice, writes down the line, doesn't quote him in the article, but keeps the cassette anyway. At a university lecture, a criminologist gives a talk titled Criminal Authority and Linguistic Power. He uses Cutolo as a primary example. He weaponized cadence, the professor says. He built infrastructure from metaphor, loyalty from ambiguity. A student raises their hand. So was he dangerous because of what he said? Or because people believed it? The professor pauses. Yes. Back in Naples, on a cool winter morning, an ex-affiliate walks alone through a cemetery. He's here for someone else, an uncle maybe. But he passes a grave with no flowers, no photo. Just a name carved into fading stone. Raffaele Cutolo. It's not a family grave. Not the real one, just a marker, unofficial, placed by someone sometime. It could be a tribute. It could be a warning. The man stops, considers, then he whispers, not a prayer, but a line from memory. A man dies once. His mistakes repeat in those who misread him. He doesn't linger. That afternoon, a teenager on the other side of town finds a wrinkled page in a used book bought from a flea market. It's written in fading ink, torn at the edges. A single verse. The poet never meant to rule. He just didn't stop them from kneeling. The teen reads it again, then again. She doesn't know the author. She tapes it to her wall. Later that week, her literature teacher notices it and hesitates. "You know who wrote that?" she asks. The girl shrugs. "No, should I?" The teacher doesn't answer, because names at a certain point become irrelevant. Only the words remain, and Cutolo knew that. That's why he kept writing. Even when the empire crumbled. Even when the followers vanished. Even when silence returned. He didn't expect forgiveness or redemption, just a place to put the last verse, and a hope, however faint, that someone would find it. The last known poem attributed to Raffaele Cutolo is never published. It's not archived, not studied, not cited in academic circles or courtroom files. It doesn't get whispered in alleyways or recited by inmates. It's not turned into graffiti or folded into a love note pretending to be about loyalty, because no one was ever meant to see it. It's found by accident, years later, in the spine of a hollowed-out dictionary once belonging to a retired prison guard, tucked so tightly between pages that the paper leaves a ghost indentation on the definitions of memory and mercy. 4 lines, no title, no signature, just this: when the voice grows quiet, it is not always gone. It waits until someone says nothing and understands. The historian who finds it doesn't publish it. She copies it, frames it, and places it on her shelf beside works by Sciascia, Pasolini, and Gramsci. She never tells anyone the source. And that's how Cutolo's story ends. Not in a trial, not in an act of violence, not even in defiance, but in the slow, gentle hush of a verse so private it forgets to be dangerous. His legacy becomes a paradox, haunting in its elegance, brutal in its consequences. No one wants to praise him. No one dares completely dismiss him. He wasn't just a criminal. He wasn't just a poet. He was a man who saw that language could command armies, hold courts, and swallow men whole if it moved just slow enough to be mistaken for a lullaby. And in that strange, quiet way, Raffaele Cutolo outlasted the machine he built, not because it thrived, but because the rhythm, the way he bent silence into signal, still lingers in the way power is spoken. Even now, many people still think that myth-making is dangerous when it's tied to violence, but more dangerous still is when it's tied to understanding. So what do you think? Is it worse to remember a monster with beauty, or to forget the beauty completely? Back in Ottaviano, a child is born in a hospital not far from where Cutolo first learned to write. The boy's father chooses his name at the last minute. Not for a relative, not for a saint. He just likes how it sounds. Raffaele. No middle name, no homage, just a name spoken softly. The doctor writes it down, somewhere, distant and fading, a silence sighs like a page being turned.